Awesome. Can you hear me? Touch your nose, touch your head, shake your tail. All right, sounds good. Yeah, so first I want to say, thank you for this opportunity. The relationship between myself and Oberlin actually began with Dr. Danielle Skihan, who was a fellow at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. And so that's something that we have as a really vibrant fellowship program at Cody, Wyoming. And so to give you an idea of where we're at, my people are from the northeast southwestern part of Montana, but traditionally occupied different areas all the way from the Canadian border, southern Canada, down to the lower part of Wyoming, beginning of Colorado. Basically, originally the Crow people were from the Great Lakes region, actually really close to this area, and then moved to the plains about the end of the 1300s, and as many tribes did in that area. And so I grew up in southeastern Montana, in Garryowen, Montana. I'm a Reno cowgirl. That's what my district is called. Yeah, it's very funny. And so in my community, my Crow name is Biabasana, and that means woman in the front. And so that was given to me by my grandmother when I was 1. And so this trip has really been about looking at systems of reciprocity. And Danielle and I began that conversation with specifically the land, right? Like first and foremost, our reciprocity in our relationship to land and our relationship to place. And so, stepping onto this campus, I recognize that this institution and many institutions in the United States, Canada, what we consider the Americas, came at a very traumatic and difficult displacement of Indigenous people and First Nations people, and people forcibly moved here against their own will. And so I want to, say that those stories are impactful and important. In that said, I mean, just saying their names I don't want to negate the experience of forcibly removing people, but this community in this area of Lorain County, Ohio, did I get that? Yeah. Belong to the Delaware, the Wyandot, the Shawnee, the Miami peoples, including those known and then tribes that were once known and lost because of colonization. And if I forgot any of them, that is my apologies, and I take responsibility for not knowing that. And so to begin, also, I want to sort of thank a few different people, Andrea, and the opportunity to work with the institution, Hannah, Amy, Danielle, and then the student that was not mentioned, Elf Zimmerman, who has done, they are a 4th-year student working with a collection and have giant dreams, very big dreams to potentially work in the humanities. And so having the opportunity to work with the students and student colleagues for many of those that are in the room is also important. So, okay, no more introductions. I'm over that. And so first, secondly, acknowledging these people, but also acknowledging if there are elders and people who have lived in this community. If I speak out of place, I'm sorry. I'm a visitor here. But again, it's my responsibility to know better. So if I say something and offend you, I'm sorry. Okay, so I wanted to start with this. My favorite poem is by Joy Harjo, who's Muskogee Creek. And Joy, can you hear me if I walk over this way? Okay. And so Joy was the 3-time US Poet Laureate. And she has this incredible poem that I actually had the opportunity to meet her last week in California for the first time. And to say this person, her creativity and her insight is incredible. And so to begin, I would like to read this poem. If you're okay, touch ears. Perfect. Okay. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and so will go on. We chase chickens, our dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At the table, we gossip, recall enemies and ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. The table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth at the table. We have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating the last sweet bite. And I think this is a really beautiful piece to begin sort of our experience. I don't like the word lecture. I don't think it's not the way that I like to teach, but to recognize these systems of reciprocity, right? For many communities and tribal communities, that begins with what happens at the table, what happens in the transaction of eating, of sharing a meal. And so when we came to campus, the first opportunity we had was to sit down and eat with students, and then the opportunity to eat after this. I also recognize I too was a poor college student, and so come and enjoy that. But I think it's also a beautiful piece to include, especially as we celebrate Native American History Month, and looking at the holiday that is at the end of this month, the Thanksgiving tradition, and recognizing that that also is a system of reciprocity. But we have to remember, how our foundation happened, as especially considering the United States will celebrate its 250th anniversary next year. So that's a part of that. And it's a beautiful, Hannah has been incredible about helping introduce pieces of the collection. And so I want to make note of this artwork is by Dene Navajo artist Raven Chacon, and it's Zikalasaw for Joy Harjo. And so it's beautiful to see elements of also honoring this person that I admire deeply. And so if we're okay and we consent to it, I'd like to maybe start with a reflection. If we're okay, yeah? Okay, touch your head. Sounds good. And so let's just take a second, right? When we start to talk about systems of colonization, systems of ingenuity, these are hard, traumatic topics. And so let's get ourselves in a place. And so let's stop, breathe, listen. Let's unclench our jaw, right? Have we been scrunching up? Drop your shoulders. Are your shoulders up to your ears? Have you felt that way? What about placing your feet? Let's get grounded. Put our feet flat down if we're able to. And close your eyes. Let's go on a journey. If you're safe and you're okay with that, close your eyes. And so I want you to think of a place in times of stress, in times that perhaps when you need to get grounded, you go to. Where is this place? What does it look like? What does it smell like? Is it cold? Is it warm? If you reach out, are you touching moisture? Is there rain? Is there snow? Can you hear the leaves? Who's there with you? What conditions is that? Okay, come back to me. When we think of place, we think of our interactions and our relationship to place. And so for myself, the place that I go to is the Bighorn Mountains in Montana. And the Bighorns is where the Crow people found their sacred tobacco. And that is the place that I like to go. It's a place called Garvin Basin. And it's where the elk migrate in the winter. Where do you go? Who occupied that land first? Have you considered that? Have you considered the impact? And so, first and foremost, let's consider what Indigenous represents. What do you call us, right? Like, this is first and foremost, like, I work quite often with different students, and they often don't know, how do you refer to Indigenous people? Do you use their tribe first? So for myself, that would be the Apsáalooke and the Yakama people, or the Apsáalooke people. Indian, there's a whole country of 1 billion people who are from India. I don't refer to them the same as us. First Nations are Indigenous, right? And so if we're able to, do we have smartphones perhaps? Can we pull our smartphones out? And if we don't, I got you still. I'm gonna pull up a picture at the end. So there is an app, it's a pretty cool app, and it's called Native Lands. And my students I had yesterday had to download this app as well. So go into your app store, might that be Apple or the Android phone, or if you don't want to, that's okay too. My feelings aren't gonna be hurt. And type in a app called nativelands.can, C-A-N. And this is an interactive map that will help show you whose indigenous lands the parts of the world occupy. And so at any given time, you can pop in there and say Australia and go see the people of Australia or New Zealand or Canada, or they're working on identifying the communities in Africa, Mesoamerica. And so what I'm trying to get at is there's not just indigenous people in the United States, there's indigenous people everywhere. Isn't that cool? It's beautiful. It's such a powerful, beautiful piece. And so, when we start to look at these different areas and we consider what our impact is, we also have to consider in a museum and in an educational setting, what kind of story we're telling. And with that, what kind of emotional currency we're willing to also interact with too. And so museums and places of academia can be really deafening and scary and traumatic places for people of color, for indigenous people, because of the foundations both of academia and of museums. Right, the first museum was in Babylon in 2,500 years ago. Our contemporary version of museums actually came from collecting items from spoils of war and spoils of colonization, especially when we start to consider the massive movement of people throughout the world. And that's where we get institutions like the British Museum, who has one of the largest collections. We also see this massive movement of colonization, and can relate that to the giant procession of the funeral procession with Queen Elizabeth, who just passed. I was like, Queen Victoria, no, she's way gone. So Queen Elizabeth, who just passed, and you're looking at these procession, and those are also spoils of war. And so these are really deeply difficult topics to talk about. And I'm grateful to be in this space to talk to college students, because you guys, gals, people, individuals, are able to interact with these concepts. And what I've found with my 4 days at Oberlin is you're not afraid to confront these topics by any means. I think you guys are kind of really feisty a little bit, honestly. And so what do we do with interpretation? What do we do with experiences? How do we conceptualize those? And so if each one of you was sitting down, our beautiful staff, our crew here at the museum was able to provide you with a pencil, a writing utensil, and 2 note cards. And so we're just gonna do an activity if you're okay. If you don't wanna do it, you're not gonna hurt my feelings either. And so you have a blue card and you have a white card. And so with each of these cards, I want you to just fold them in half. It doesn't matter to me. But thank you, hot dog or hamburger. I had to use that in one of the lessons. And if you don't have a card, please raise your hand. And if you want to participate, we'd be happy to also provide that with you. And so I'm going to show you 8 images. Some of the images are paired. I want to note that there is nudity in one of them. And so if that is something that is going to affect you, then I will just warn you and you can shut your eyes and then we'll move on. So before that image comes up. And so on the blue card is going to be the bad. And basically what I want you to do in this activity is to think of the first feeling or the first thought or the first word as I show these images. But I'm going to preface this on a good, or I'm going to preface this on a bad. And so the blue card is bad. The white card is good. The blue card is, okay, the white card is, and you guys are all good. I put you all on the white card. Okay, and so for this first image, I want you to write the bad. Just write first thought, just first thought. Do you see me how I see me? This is the activity that we wanna do. So on one side of the blue card, your first thought. So of course, we're in Lorain County. I had to go there. I had to talk about the Cleveland Indians, who are now the Cleveland Guardians, and representing systems of mascot and pageantry. And so very honored to have a community member who worked very hard in the audience to dispel and rename and be a part of the group that advocated for the renaming of mascots, who are now the Cleveland Guardians. Does your perception change now that I told you that they've changed their name? What really impacted me about this image is it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter how the people felt, how the advocates felt when changing the name. It was that these community members, these fans, were so deeply impacted by the loss of their identity. Do you see me how I see me? They saw themselves lost in this experience. So September 27, 2021, that was the retirement of Chief Wahoo and the Cleveland Indians as an organization, who are now the Cleveland Guardians. 106 years of the use of this mascot. Yeah, RIP, see ya. Okay, let's pull out one half of our white card. Let's think about the good. So how do we respond to the image? I'm not gonna, if some of you might know who this is, some of you might not. Think of something good. Do we know who this is? Anybody? Diego Rivera, yeah. Does your perception change now that I've told you that this is a self-portrait of Diego Rivera? And if it changed, you don't have to put it there, but just maybe consider thinking about it. And so I was very surprised as I was doing research to come across the collections, not surprised that those collections were here, but that there's so many impactful names in Oberlin's museum collection. And this is a self-portrait of Diego Rivera and his impact on Mexican-American and Mexican art. Okay, some of you actually might know this from the Oberlin community, the next one. Let's think of the bad. Going back to our blue card. And some of you might be very familiar with the image on the left. And maybe not so much the image on the right. Are we good? Did we respond? Okay, this is a bust on the left made of Oberlin alumni, Edmonia Lewis, who has, a very tragic history with this institution, almost being beaten to death at one point, and the impact that they have of Oberlin's relationship with women and with people of color in its initial admission of students. On the right is, I'm trying really hard not to, I want to say this name right, Yolande Olabaku. Did I say that right? Pretty close. So this is a piece that was commissioned by the museum on the right to honor Edmonia. And they actually worked hand in hand with many of the communities, the Black and trans community, to honor Edmonia's place here. Are we on the good or are we on the bad? What did we just do? Bad. Okay, we're doing good. This is very hard to see. Some of you actually might be aware of this piece. Context, right? It's very hard to write context with something like this. So to give you an idea, this is a piece by Felix Gonzalez Torres that was made in the 90s. And this artist is representing a week's worth of gun violence in their community. So this is 460 individuals who were victims of gun violence. There's nothing good about that, right? But this is a very impactful piece and poignant in our today's society. And I got to see this, and this piece is ginormous, by the way. Bad. What do we think of these two images? What's bad about them? Oh, I didn't warn you. I'm sorry. There's nudity in this. That was my fault. So these are two photographs that are in the Oberlin collection, and they're of two different indigenous groups. There on your left is elders from the Ainu people of Japan. And on the right is one community member who is identified as both from Samoa. And I think these are powerful, right? They go to show what indigenous and ingenuity looks like and what gender looks like. So we're on the good right now, right? Good. What's good about this? Does our perception change if I told you that these are Andy Warhols? Does your perception change if I told you that Theodore Roosevelt on the right made the statement, all good Indians are dead Indians? Does your perception change? Does your perception change if I tell you that Sitting Bull was a prisoner of war, murdered by his own people? Context, right? Okay, and I think this might be our last image, if it'll load. Oh, maybe. Let's give it some sprinkle hands. Do sprinkle hands? There we go. Are we on the good or the bad? Bad. Okay. What's impactful about these two images is that they were taken in the same place 30 years apart. The image on the right is Dr. Joseph Medicine Crow, and he is the last chief of the Plains. He's the last chief to gain war honors in a nation fighting in World War II when he was born and he wasn't a citizen. The man on the left is one of my grandpas. That's veteran Daryl Lone Bear, and he's a veteran of Korea and a veteran of Vietnam. And finally, our last image. Come on, sprinkle hands, sprinkle hands. Okay, our last image, let's really hit it home here. And finally, I wanted the opportunity to highlight a little bit from our collection. And so these are two images from Thomas Bailey Marquess. And Thomas Bailey Marquess was a photographer that lived at the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, which when I picked these images, I did not recognize, and maybe that's because the things were put in place, the Cheyenne collections here at Oberlin. Does your perception change when I tell you that this is Hollowwood and Minnie Hollowwood? And Minnie Hollowwood on the right is one of the few women to earn the right to wear a feather bonnet because she was at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. She fought Custer. Her people did. And the image that you're seeing on the left is her husband pointing out where she was grazed by a bullet. Isn't that kick-ass? So powerful. Okay, thank you so much. And so what we'll have do is we'll have our awesome team come down the center, and we're going to collect these and make a word cloud. And basically, we're going to have a visual representation of what impact looks like, right? When we look at images and we have no context, does that change? What is our first responses to those? And so our awesome team is going to collect those from the center. And so if you just want to transfer them, sorry, I changed my mind. Yeah, take them to the center. Our team's like, what are they saying? Are we feeling good? Are we okay? I'm sorry I didn't warn you about the picture with nudity. That was on me. I apologize. And so I think what we'll do is we're just gonna sit for a second. Let's just sit on some of the images that we looked at. This was just a sampling of different collections that are in the Plains Indian Museum, the Buffalo Center, the West, where I'm from, and then collections that were here at Oberlin. And basically, when we're talking about indigeneity and we're talking about decolonization, we want to introduce concepts of interpretation. We want to introduce concepts of impactful engagement. Basically, decolonization is an academic concept that began in the 50s. And it was looking at, how do we look at academia and how do we relate the experiences of many different nations who were grappling with their colonial past and still remain and continue to grapple with the colonial past. Might that have been the mass transfer of European nations that were in Meso and South America? Might that be those that were also in Africa, parts of Asia, standing next to this image of this man who was impacted and had his hand in the East India Trading Company, right? Like these images permeate everywhere. Decolonization truly is the dismantling of those institutions, right? So to truly decolonize, it's both physical and metaphorical burning down, right? Like, oh my gosh, I could see Andrew, like, let's burn down the museum. No, please don't do that. I know you guys are super political and active. Do not burn down the museum. But let's burn down these concepts, right? Let's burn down these concepts where ingenuity is introducing concepts where we take away the idea of patriarchy and reintroduce these systems of responsibility and these systems of recognizing multiple people, multiple genders, multiple belief systems. And so what was important to show in these images was I wanted to give you a sampling of who's telling the stories, right? Where are they coming from? Who are they representing? What genders are represented? And so when we start to think of that, we look at identities and, right, like hitting you hard with the Cleveland Indians and ending with these awesome examples of positive impacts of tribal people. Like that is what indigeneity looks like. And it's effective, right? It's effective in its process, but that's not an easy process. And so we think of colonization, right? Colonization was basically a 500-year period, give or take. I know there's some anthropologists in here. There's some historians who can tell me the exact dates, but it took 500 years of cumulative history to get to where we're at. I hope it doesn't take 500 years of cumulative history to dismantle those, but it's a slow process. And that begins when we look at the way in which academia and museums are presenting content and who is telling those stories. That is the key component to all of this. And so when we start to introduce, we hear a lot of this, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Rarely do we include access. These are concepts. So diversity usually is people, right? Like we tend to negate the experiences and tell like diversity and it's physical. It's just the outer presentation. Equity is not equality because those are not the same processes. Equity is giving people the right amount of services. Equality is giving people all of the services equally. Did I explain that right? Okay. And inclusion is something that, to be inclusive is a policy and practice. But access, right? Access is key. And so I was recently in an experience where I was working with an institution and they had some very strict policies around tribal community members, any community members for that matter, but tribal community members coming in and viewing these collections. And I didn't know what that place was from. I couldn't tell where it was. I didn't know if it was because they were afraid the Indians are going to come and take their stuff back. They probably should. What about the other nations and their things? No, access is giving the opportunity. I used that word, giving. Didn't mean to do that. It's taking what is rightfully our place and our position and viewing those collections and saying, I'm going to advocate on those behalf, to touch them, to sing to them. And this was really hard for me. This was something I had not experienced in my life before, coming into a collection and not being able to physically touch something, to not sing, to not celebrate, to stand here with my hands back and look at it. In 2022, that's still happening. Access is about opportunity. It's not about being afraid that the Indians are going to come in and take your stuff. It's about them coming in and taking back parts of their identity. All nations should have that opportunity. When we are doing DEI, and I like to change the narrative on DEI, we tend to focus a lot on diversity. Diversity is an outward presentation. Inclusion is what you can put in policy. Let's change that narrative. Let's call it IDEA. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. Who's in the room? Who's advocating? What do they look like? Where are they from? What are their life experiences? How do we quantify that? Is everybody in your room, are they all PhDs? Do they all have $500,000 in the account? No, that's not what we're asking for. People advocating for their needs, they have to come from different backgrounds, and we have to quantify that in different ways. You can't tell me a tribal elder who has a lived experience is less of an expert than a PhD who has only learned about the content in academia. Those will never match. That will never match. The same can be said for, we have to have our expectations about what equity looks like. With the nonprofit phenomena, I'm going to say that, because I know museums and academia are nonprofits. A lot of it is relegated to how much money you can afford with the fiduciary responsibility. When you have First Nations people, or you have people from different backgrounds, they don't always have the access to provide $3,500 a year to sit on a board. And so you have to think critically about what is their representation. And that is why in 2022, there's so few board of trustees that are people of color. What kind of cumulative work has been done on policy, inclusion, and recruitment? And so as we look at DEI and IDEA practices, it can't be enough to just add more people to a system that's already failing. It's doing the work, the cumulative work in policy. Might that be, looking at governance 3 or 4 times a year and taking these steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, 10 years down the road and strategically placing that. And finally, what are you doing it for? What is the entire process? Are your practice virtue seeking? Are you doing this because you're being held accountable by other people? Are you centering yourself around this practice? Oh my gosh, we are the most diverse people. Let's put it on social media and tell everybody. Social media is as quick as a scroll. Is it centered around people, or is it centered around the institution? People sustain institutions. Institutions don't sustain people. We forget that in policy. And finally, what do we do with actionable statements? And so I made a lot of statements today, and again, I wouldn't make those statements if I couldn't back them in one way or another. Land acknowledgement is the beginning, right? We started this activity and this conversation around place, this beautiful place that we occupy, looking up. And so if we're okay, look up. There's these beautiful conditions and these representation of life, of being. Tribal people, Indigenous people know that. They know place. We know where the place comes from. We know where the water is. We know where the land, how the land sings, what it says to us. What is our statements of impact? What are we doing to back up these claims, to back up these quote unquote diverse activities? Are we taking the hard-hitting truths? Are we talking about stolen lands? Are we talking about colonization? Are we talking about diaspora? These are key components that have to be in this policy. And finally, if you are uncomfortable, you're in the right place. If you're not comfortable in this work, don't do it. Don't make the statements, don't claim it. You have to sit in that discomfort and you have to be able to listen. And when I started earlier this week, I said that with the students. Thank you. Thank you for letting me be out of my element, talking to you and discussing these activities with you and learning these impactful pieces, but also for Oberlin to sit and listen, for the institution to sit and listen, because this is hard, difficult work. And we're not there. Our generations are probably not going to be there yet, but I think we're working towards that. And essentially that is why I stayed in museums and continue to do so. Okay, so wow, there's a lot of words here. Okay, so a little bit about word cloud. This is a computer generated program. And so basically what you do is you put in singular words and it populates. The bigger words are what frequently showed up. And so that is more entries. And so as we're looking at these images, right, we see our good and our bad. There was really no delineation between the color, but character shows up often, right? We saw that in the Warhol image. Perhaps we saw that in how do I want to say this? The internment for Chief Wahoo, you know, his death of Chief Wahoo. Stereotypes. Like, what kind of stereotypes are we playing into? Or what kind of stereotypes are we enforcing? You know, there's also a piece of that sometimes BIPOC people of color allow. Representation. You heard me say that probably a dozen times. Racist. Yeah. Take a deep breath. Breathe out. I've read a lot of Ibram Kendi's work and Jason Reynolds, and they created a book called Stamped, Stamping Out Racism, I believe. And it's funny because every time you see the word race mentioned, you take a deep breath. Race, breathe out. I see racism, appropriation, dehumanizing, violent, beautiful. These are those positives. These are those impactful pieces. I want to see the impactful pieces. The negative is just as important as the positive. And we have to sit on these words and think about that. Cool. Thank you.